Alright, well met Mage Knights, and welcome back to our tutorial series on combat in the Mage Knight board game. In our last video, we covered the use of spells generally, with a slight lean toward the offensive side of things, and before that, of course, we examined the two attack phases, which, in other words, would be the phases in which you flex your mageness and things kind of keel over in front of you. Well, fun time's over, buddy, because now the bad guys get a turn. Today, we take a look at the block phase. I want to start out by noting that this discussion should actually go relatively quickly, because so much of what needs to be said about blocking mirrors what we've already seen elsewhere. And I don't think we really need to get into the weeds on any of the issues regarding textual interpretation or mana management, which our discussion of spells required. We're just going to have a look pretty simply at where block comes from, what sorts of attacks you're going to face, and how to figure out if your block is successful or not. And then we'll pretty much call it a day. Now, if you recall from episode 1, when an enemy attacks you, they have to get through your blocks before they can start applying any damage to you. These attacks, if there are multiple, will then have to be dealt with one at a time. You cannot group them to maximize your block efficiency. And in fact, some enemies rely on this for a big share of their relative difficulty. Additionally, while there are effects that can be played which reduce the strengths of attacks, these reductions do not count as blocks per se, which actually is a good thing, because blocks, by contrast, are all or nothing and do not reduce the effect of an attack unless they prevent it completely, whereas reductions remain in place either way. So what you're going to do is apply any reductions or alterations to the quality of an attack, if any, before you consider the success of any blocks that you throw up in front of it. The force and nature of that modified attack are then kind of locked in place, as it were, and you move through onto the consideration of the block, at which point either the attack is blocked in its entirety, doing no damage at all, or else the entire force of the previously modified attack and any attendant effects that it might still be bringing with it will then come through at full force. At that point, the only question left to answer would be, who is it on your side that's going to be the one taking that beating? The which discussion will be the subject of the next video in our series. Before we get into where you get block and how it interacts with attacks, we need to say a bit about the kinds of attacks that you're going to be facing. For starters, of course, you have physical attacks like you see here. See the little clenched fist with the 11 on it. And of course here on the werewolf, you got a fist with 7. Fist indicating a straight up physical attack. This will just have a number atop the fist, and you'll need to match that number straight up in order to block it. Though there may be special qualities like swiftness that you're going to have to factor in as well, but we'll come back to that in a moment. Next, you might have elemental attacks like we have over here with the ice mages. This is also going to be a number, except this time it's going to be presented on top of an element icon, like this little kind of frosty orb here. And again, you're just going to be matching this number in order to block it. But it might be a little bit harder to match this number than the physical number, because your blocks may or may not work at full effect against an elemental attack. Again, we'll get into some of those details in a moment. But basically, at root, for the vast majority of attacks, you just have the attack with an attack value, and you match it with your block value in order to block it. Boom. Simple. One really funky wrinkle, though, that can come up has to do with summoners. And we see a couple of them here. You've got the illusionist and the orc summoner. These guys will not have an attack value listed on their token at all. Instead, they have a picture of a brown dungeon token in the spot that you would normally find the attack value. This indicates that these guys don't attack you directly, but instead summon up a surrogate attacker to do their dirty work. And there's in advance no telling what foe they're going to pull out of their sleeve until you get into the block phase. This, of course, makes planning for them a little bit tougher, but here's how the process works. All you're going to do is draw a random brown token from the stack, and let's just suppose that turned out to be this werewolf here for convenience. You're going to take whatever attack is listed on that brown token, in this case 7 physical with swiftness, and you're going to treat the summoner in question as though they had that attack on their token natively. So you're going to kind of look at the illusionist, say, and pretend that he had a 7 fist and the swiftness icon on his token, and then attack as though that a werewolf attack is coming from this illusionist token. This is going to include any element or special qualities that are on the surrogate, the summoned token. The brown enemy is not going to then stick around, and you don't have to kill it later on. It's not reinforcing the enemy with additional manpower or anything like that. It's just kind of loaning its attack for a minute. In fact, these guys right here are actually called illusionists, so I guess the flavor here is that they're not even calling up a real foe, just some sort of figment or phantasm or something like that, and somehow it manages to hit you just as hard as a real werewolf would. So once you've found out what the attack is, you can actually then just get rid of that token. You can just discard it. The summoner is basically just borrowing, again, that token's attack value for a sec. So the illusionist, or the orc summoner here, you run into him in a field and he's like, "Hey, Wolfman, help a brother out, yo." And the Wolfman comes up and takes a swipe at you, and then he just kind of wanders off. I don't know, he's chasing a deer or something. You would then proceed to the attack phase and only have to kill the summoner who's left behind, because Wolf Boy here was just sort of passing through. So let's play through a summoning combat, simple version of it, and kind of see how that basic mechanic works. What I have here is the illusionist token. Imagine we run into him in a mage tower or something. We're going to start out, of course, in the ranged attack phase. And you might think, oh, well, I've got swiftness, take care of him really quick. But of course, he's got physical resistance. And what that means is I would need to generate 6 ranged attack of the physical variety in order to kill him. Swiftness is going to get me 3. I could play the shock troops for 1. But that's not really going to help me too much. I could play the shock troops to reduce his armor by 1, but all that means is I'm going to have to generate 4 attack, and I still don't quite have enough. Remember, of course, that I cannot play cards sideways in order to generate ranged attack. So even something like this, which the effect of this is to treat a sideways card as 2. That only applies, of course, if you're allowed to play a sideways card in the first place. So since I can't generate ranged attack with sideways cards, even something like that won't help me. So I don't have any way currently with this situation to take this guy out in the ranged attack phase. We would then proceed to the block phase. And it's at that point that I would find out what enemy he'd drawn. Let's suppose I get relatively lucky and only have to face a gargoyle. The gargoyles are hard to kill, but his armor and resistance don't matter. All he's doing is lending an attack to the illusionist, and its attack's not really that bothersome. It's just 5 physical with nothing special about it. So what that means is I would then have to generate 5 block, and I'm going to imagine that fist was here on the illusionist token. So is there any way I can generate 5 block? There's actually a bunch of ways I could generate 5 block. I could play the rage card for 2 block, right, straight up. I could play a card sideways for another block. I could play the Udam Swordsman for 3 block. So even that with rage just by itself would be would be 5 block right there. I might be able to go in with the shock troops, reduce one enemy attack by 3. As a consequence, I have to deal with something in the damage phase, but we're kind of putting a pin in that for now. So that would actually reduce this attack all the way down to 2, at which point the rage card would be fine. So that would be another way to block it. And of course, Tovak has his little skill here that he could flop down. I could choose the 3 physical block and get 3 that way. So that with the rage card would be plenty. And I could even toggle something like this and drop down this healing card sideways. And in so doing, generate another 2 block on top of this, throw down another card sideways. You get the idea. I got a whole bunch of ways that I can generate 5 block, at which point this token is just thrown into the discard pile, and this guy is treated as blocked. Another thing to bear in mind is the potential of facing multiple attacks. With the advent of the Lost Legion especially, this can happen from actually even a single token, as indicated by the presence of multiple attack entries on the token. As you can see here, here, and here, these tokens have multiple attacks listed. And of course, if you're facing multiple enemies, then each enemy in the fight will attack you, so you're going to be facing multiple attacks even if there aren't multiples on tokens. That's of course assuming your enemies survive the ranged attack phase. And then once you get into the block phase, any and all attacks are something that you're going to have to reckon with, whether they're coming from single tokens or multiple tokens. The list of situations, therefore, that would involve you facing multiple enemy attacks at one time would be, of course, when you're assaulting a city and there's 4 or 5 units in there. Maybe you're tackling a ruin, and some of the ruin tokens that you're going to see actually are going to have multiple enemies listed as kind of the ruin guardians that you'll have to defeat. A situation in which maybe you're provoking multiple rampaging enemies. So for instance, if you've got a couple of rampagers, let's just imagine you had 2 of these guys side by side somehow. If you are moving next to a rampager from one space that is adjacent to him directly into another space that's adjacent to him, you provoke that rampaging enemy. So of course, if you're adjacent to 2 and you move and you're sticking to adjacent to 2, they're both going to engage you as a result of that movement. So that's another place in which you might have multiple enemies attacking you. And then of course, whenever you assault a keep, I think I originally had this guy here. If you assault a site, fortification, when you go in there, even if you're not provoking an enemy as a result of movement, if there is an enemy that is adjacent, a rampager that is adjacent to a site that you're assaulting, then you always have an option, if you want to take that enemy and add them to the combat. It's just an option you have. It's in the rules. So that would be, of course, another place in which you're facing multiple enemies, and therefore, no matter what enemies you're facing multiple attacks. But now, regardless of whether the attacks that you're facing are all from one enemy or from a slew of enemies, the block phase really doesn't care. The result within the block phase is exactly the same. You just have a pile of attacks, and they all have to be dealt with one at a time. Each of them is either blocked or will damage you in its turn. So in the case of something like the Hydra, you face 3 attacks in sequence, blocking or eating each one as it comes. In the case of the heroes here, you'd face 1 physical and 1 elemental attack, and again, each one is blocked or eaten as it comes. There's no lumping together of attacks, and that's actually part of the unique challenge of an enemy like the Hydra. It's often a lot easier to come up with 6 points of block than it is to come up with 3 individual 2-point blocks. For instance, you might have a pair of 3-pointers or a 4-point block and a 2-point block, which is not going to allow you to block 3 separate attacks. You're going to have to play a 2-point on a 2 and then a 4-point on another 2, but then the extra points there are wasted. The flip side of this, though, is that there's a bit of an advantage in that if you have some block, even if you don't have the full 6, you can still kind of chip away at the offense that is coming in by blocking some but not all of the attacks. So for instance, if you have only 2 2-point blocks, you're going to be able to take away 2 of those attacks and only 1 is going to come through, whereas if he had a 6-point block, you wouldn't have enough to stop it and you'd be hit by all 6. So it's a bit of a give and take. Point for point, these enemies tend to be a little bit harder to escape from unscathed than their one-shot counterparts. But on the other hand, they generally won't be getting everything through to hit you either. And then finally, believe it or not, there are multi-attack summoners. That's a thing now with the Lost Legion. In the case of one of these guys, again, what you'd have to do is you have 2 attacks, and each is going to be dealt with separately, but each is coming from a randomly drawn brown token, just as before. And it's, again, just lending its attack attributes, whatever they are, and it's not joining the combat itself. So these 2 enemy tokens will just be discarded once the attack is resolved, and you've either blocked it or not. So it all shakes out just like a regular summoner, except you just have to do it twice. So yeah, as a result, you could conceivably run into this a-hole right here and pull 2 Hydras for his 2 summons. And as a result, what you're going to do is when you face that dragon and you get into the block phase, you're going to be facing 6 attacks from that one enemy. It's good times. As was the case with generating attack points, you will have to generate block points via one of 3 different sources. These include units, skills, and your deed cards. Deed cards, of course, are going to include your basic action cards, your advanced action cards, your spell cards, and your artifact cards. Possibly one of these played sideways, because of course you can play a card sideways to generate basic block. As was the case when we considered the generation of attack, we're going to need to note here that deed cards may natively generate different amounts of block, different types of block, or of course no block at all, depending on whether or not you're using the strong or the weak effects, at times depending on the further choice that you make when playing a card, which of course will be detailed in the text of the card itself. For instance, you might have the Rage card or the Cold Toughness card, and you have a choice between attack or block when you play those. Now, in the block phase, of course, there's not really much of a choice. You're going to be playing block if you're playing it in the block phase. But you might have something like the Shield Mastery skill, which allows you to choose between physical block 3, basic block, or 2 points of ice block, or 2 points of fire block. So when you play that, you of course have to choose which one you're going to be using. So you have to read the text of any cards or skills very carefully in order to know exactly what your options are. Again, as was the case with attack, whenever you're generating block, there will be a numerical value associated with it. And of course, you'll have a particular enemy attack in mind when you're playing that block. And multiple values of block can be lumped together to form, from multiple sources to be played against a single attack. Based on the type of attack that's coming in and the type of block that's being thrown up in front of it, the points involved in those blocks might be either efficient or, of course, they might be inefficient, in which case the point value of those attacks would be cut in half. There's no consideration during this phase of anything like, for instance, fortification, ranged versus melee, anything like that. All enemy attacks unless they've been antecedently stopped in some way, for instance by a special effect that says target enemy doesn't attack this combat. Any attacks that are coming through will have to be reckoned with in this phase. And, outside of something like a unit being disallowed because you're burning a monastery or something like that, and they just won't help, any amount of block that you can come up with will always be legal to play in the block phase. Though, of course, you might not have the mana necessary to play the card. You may have better options, and it might be ill-advised to play a block card. And then, of course, what block you might generate may still be insufficient to counter the attack in question anyway. But you do have these three sources of block, and you know that in the block phase, this is the one place where you're going to be using block. Of course, when you use block, your enemies will still have a few tricks up their sleeves that you will have to worry about. Now, again, in the attack phases, the attacks that you can generate are either physical, fire, or cold attacks, and the enemy may have resistances to some subset of those, potentially causing your attacks to become inefficient. In the block phase, you might think that you can, in parallel fashion, have resistances to attacks that are coming in at you, and thereby have the enemy's incoming attack values. But instead, the parallel that we have to the attack phase is not a happy one. Instead, the parallel that we have is rather that once again the enemy will have a type or a quality to their attack, and that type or quality either does or does not have the value of your stuff, which in this case is now, of course, your block. When the enemy attacks you with a physical attack, any block you put forth will be fully efficient. These are basic enemy attacks, and just as when they have no special resistances to trot out in the attack phase, and that allows you to use any attack at full effect, here you can use any block against a physical attack with no problem. Sweet. But so ends pretty much all the good news that you're going to get. When the enemy produces a fire attack, say, the only block that is efficient against it is an ice block. And of course you might have something called a cold fire block, which you can think of as just being both ice, fire, the two at the same time as needed. Basically, a cold fire block is just always efficient. So it's actually pretty badass. Similarly, when the enemy produces a cold attack, the only efficient block against it would be a fire or, of course, a cold fire block. Basically, when the enemy produces a cold fire attack, you guessed it, only a cold fire block is going to be efficient against that. Now, it might help you to remember and keep all of this straight if you just consider your blocks as having to cover any and all elemental bases by providing an element that is in opposition to any and all elements present in an enemy attack. In other words, to counter fire, you provide ice. Against ice, fire. And cold fire attacks and blocks provide both. Fortunately, a block cannot be rendered inefficient multiple times over or anything like that, so your block values are never going to be quartered or anything quite that horrible. You just check the attack that you're blocking, determine for every point of block that you throw at it whether it's going to go into the efficient or the inefficient pile, and then you have the inefficient pile to find your total block points. And again, if this meets or exceeds the target number for blocking the attack, then the attack has been blocked and it produces no damage at all. If, on the other hand, your total fails to match the value of the attack coming through it, then you may as well pick up your cards, because the attack will come through at full strength, and you will have to deal with it in the assigned damage phase as though you hadn't blocked anything. And of course, we're going to examine that in our next video. As we've said, attacks must be dealt with one at a time, so there's no grouping of attacks for the sake of efficiency, but neither is there ever any question or confusion about what happens when a physical attack is mixed with a fire attack or anything like that. They're just dealt with one at a time in their turn, and you can actually pick which ones you want to reckon with first, because it doesn't really matter in the end which one hits you first, since you have to work your way through the whole list anyway. So for just a couple of quick examples here, if I'm facing these, I think they're called fire golems. They've got 3 points of fire attack. They have the brutal quality, which we'll talk about in a little bit, but let's just deal with the 3 points of fire attack. If I throw ice block at it by playing cold toughness, that's blocked straight up because ice block is efficient against fire. So that would be enough right there. If for some reason I didn't have that, or I was saving it for something else, and I wanted to use anything other than ice block, or a combination of a lesser ice block, then I'm going to have to deal with the fact that some of my block is inefficient. So if I played block from Rage, I get 2 points of block, but it's really only counting as 1 against this. So I've added 1 point of block versus this 3-point target that I have. I might take 4 other cards and play them all sideways to get 4 more points of basic block, which is cut in half, so that I would have a total of 6 cut in half to 3, and that would be enough again to block that. Or I might play my shield mastery, opt for the cold block option, the ice block option. That's going to be efficient, providing 2 points. I would then have maybe Rage providing an inefficient 2 points, which is cut to 1, but 2 plus 1 still totals 3, which is going to be enough to block this guy. Okay, if I'm for some reason left with only playing a fire block or something like that, it's not like even more inefficient against this. It's just as inefficient as a physical block. So fire block 7, if I was to play flame wall with like a mana crystal, that would actually be enough to block this guy, even though it's fire, because 7 cut in half rounds down to 3, and that's enough. So I have a bunch of options to block this guy. He's not a big worry. If I face somebody like the ice mages, that's when I need fire block. My ice block here is not going to be efficient. My regular block's not going to be efficient. I do have a fire block option here, and of course I have the fire block option here. So this by itself would again be enough, because 7 efficient points is plenty to tackle 7. To tackle 5. Okay, so I could block as well. If I'm facing a cold fire block, I don't have any cold fire options anywhere. This is either fire or cold. This is always fire. This is always cold. And none of these guys give me anything elemental in terms of blocking. So I will not have anything at all efficient to play against this guy. So as far as I'm concerned, he's got an 8-point attack coming at me. The good news is it's only doing 4 damage when it hits, but I still, if I want to block it, I have to generate 8 points of block. I could do that in a bunch of different ways. And again, I have options to play cards sideways to generate that. I've got units here. So I will be able to generate 8 points of block. It's just blocking him is going to chew up a lot of resources. Finally, I might have a massive 9-point fire attack from something like this fire dragon. Only my ice block is going to be efficient. I might play my shield mastery for 2 points of cold. I might play cold toughness for 2 points of cold. That's 5 points of cold, but I need 4 more points of block in order to successfully block this guy. Otherwise, I'm getting hit by that full 9 points of damage. So I need to come up with, since nothing else that I have is efficient, I need to come up with 8 points of regular inefficient block to make up the difference here, because when that's cut in half to 4, it adds to my 3 efficient block, and I get a total of 9. So I could again do that with fire block and rage, or I could toggle a couple of units here. I got 5 here and 3 here. I could play both those units and keep these cards, maybe. So that would be 3 plus 5 would give me 8, cut in half is 4, added to the 3 and the 2 would be a total of 9, allowing me to block that guy. So that's just really quick, dirty fashion how blocking is going to work against elements. Okay, so we know where to get block, that sometimes it's inefficient due to the type of attack that's coming in, and we know that when we're figuring out whether a block was successful, we're comparing the total block points to the incoming attack value. Before we can close the book on blocking, however, we have to consider just a couple more things. The first two being attacks with swift or brutal qualities. Up until now, we've halved our block values at times because of elementals. We have considered the attack values as simply a number read off of the token and treated that as our target number. There are, however, there's really two things that the attack number on a token generally does. First, it provides you with the necessary total that your target number for blocking, and then two, it provides the amount of damage that you're going to take when the attack is not blocked. Either of these things, independently of the other, can be at times doubled, and that's what swift and brutal does, respectively. When an attack is swift, as indicated by the winged arrow on the token, this means that the amount of block needed to stop the attack from hurting you, the target number of block points that you have to generate to block the attack, is going to be twice that listed on the token. So we've got the werewolf here. If we're trying to block that, we need 14 points of block, and it's physical, so anything counts at full strength. If we're facing this ice dragon here, that's 8 points of cold attack. So we would then have to generate 8 points of block, reckoning with the fact that some of our block may not be efficient. When an attack is brutal, by contrast, as indicated by the kind of, I guess, red bloody skull, this actually has no impact whatsoever on the block phase, but instead is going to indicate that if the attack is not blocked, then it's going to double the attack rating on the token when you're determining how much damage is done. Okay, so this guy still you might have to reckon with inefficiency, but he's only got 3 points of as its target number to block. But if he hits you, he's doing 6 points of damage. This guy here, he's just straight up physical attack, only 4 points, but if you let it through, he's going to hit you for 8. And that's as hard as some dragons hit you. So you don't want to not block that guy. So it actually doesn't have any impact on the block phase at all. So you might wonder why I'm talking about it. I felt it was wise to mention it here just because of the symmetry that it has with swiftness. In that, again, they both respectively double the attack value listed on the token for one or the other of the two things that number is ever used for. Now, to my knowledge, there is no token that has both swiftness and brutal in either the base game or, in fact, in either expansion. But consider such a fictional token for a minute. Imagine one exists, because it's going to lead us into a discussion of something that's actually pretty important to being successful in the game. As was the case when we considered that an enemy that has all three resistances against your attacks in the attack phase, one might wonder whether an enemy that has both swiftness and brutal might have just been made a whole lot simpler by just doubling the initial attack rating and leaving it at that. After all, if swift doubles the block target and brutal doubles the damage, and if that's all the attack rating ever really does is tell you the block target and how much damage it does, then why bother with the icons and the extra headache? Why not just double the number and leave it? But if for no other reason than that there are actually a handful of block effects that are doubled against swift attacks, like for instance on this Utum Guardsman, their block 4 counts twice against an attack with swiftness. So that counts as 8 points of block against this guy. The target number is still 14, but he's giving you 8 instead of 4. So I only need to come up with 6 more to block this guy. Right? Or against this guy, it's 8 points of cold block. This is only going to count as 8 points of regular block, but when it's cut in half, it's still counting as 4, so I'm still taking out half of this attack here. Right? So there are such effects, and therefore it would actually matter whether you're doing this swift brutal attack or just a doubled number. Moreover, and this is really why I'm discussing this fictional token to begin with, because there are effects that reduce the value of an attack by X amount, which effects take place before an attack is doubled by either swiftness or brutal, those attack reductions would have double the effect. So I had actually under here, I had the shock troops. And these guys have an effect that reduces one enemy attack by 3, if you remember. Or you can reduce the armor by 1 and the attack of a chosen enemy by 1. Right? So if you play either of those effects, the number on the token is actually reduced before being doubled. So those attack reductions would then consequently have effectively double their effect. The point I'm laboring to make here is that while the value of these attack reductions are generally understood to be pretty high, still, because people sometimes forget that they're even better against swift attacks and brutal attacks, they can actually sometimes be underestimated, even by people who think they're pretty awesome. Note as well, before we move on, that when an attack against you is elemental and you lack efficient block, then reducing the attack by some number is again going to be twice as effective as playing that number of block, or playing some number of block and getting it cut in half. So then consider an attack that is maybe both elemental and swift, as we have here on this dragon. Right? This is going to make our attack number doubled, and any attacks that we have that are not efficient against it are going to be cut in half. So in a large number of situations, a lot of the cards we're going to be playing are effectively quartered in their effectiveness versus that target number on the token. So if you're left playing basic block, then point per point, you're at a 4-to-1 disadvantage trying to block that attack versus the number on the token. Okay, because again it's doubled and your block values are halved. So any attack reduction that reduces that target number before stuff is doubled and before your counters are cut in half, the effect of the reduction is actually going to be quadrupled in its importance. Okay, blocking's hard, so anything you can do to kind of make it easier on yourself is a real good idea. Now for a tidbit of good news. There's a funny little quality introduced with the Lost Legion expansion called cumbersome. Flavor-wise, it's meant to reflect the fact that I guess it's awfully hard to hit, for instance, a prancy little elf warrior or a freaking flying half-dragon wizard. It's hard to hit something like that using a catapult. You know, if you've ever tried it, you know where I'm coming from. Mechanically, now that we've already got a sense of how attack reduction effects work and how awesome they are, the way this works, we can just say is going to be simple enough to understand and can be summed up in a few words. Against a cumbersome enemy, movement can be played to reduce the attack value of the enemy. Because move is often fairly abundant and otherwise useless in a lot of combats, and because, for the reasons we just went into a few moments ago, attack reduction is just flat out better than block point for point, This is very handy. Mage Knight will very quickly train you to dread every last little icon you see on an enemy's token. But this one, believe it or not, this little boulder icon is actually 100% good news for you. Its only effect is to give you reduction options. And while many, if not most, of the attack reducing effects that you generate from spells and the like that will affect enemies in a similar fashion, will actually very often have in their description restrictions saying that you can't lower an attack below 1 or anything like that. By contrast, the cumbersome quality description explicitly allows the attack to be reduced to 0. And it explicitly declares that attack to then count as blocked, in case that matters, for purposes of something like the counterattack card, which gives you attack for every enemy that you block. So if you play a bunch of movement to reduce the attack to 0, say you had 7 movement points versus this catapult, you count as blocking him. You can then play counterattack and get additional block because of it. And of course, if you're facing a fire catapult, it's that much nicer to be reducing that attack because you might not have ice block to throw up in front of it. So throwing down movement is that much nicer. So yeah, when you see this little boulder, try to, I don't know, see it like it's a white chocolate truffle or something like that, because really it's delightful. The last few effects that you're going to see on enemy tokens up through the Lost Legion expansion are Poison, Paralysis, and Assassin. These all very much suck, but none of them are your shield's problem. You're going to ignore them completely in the block phase, at least outside of planning what you want to do. Briefly put, poison attacks are going to add additional wounds whenever you or your units are taking wounds in the first place because you've been hit by them. The assassination quality is going to limit what you can do in the assigned damage phase. It's going to prevent you from using units to take damage for you. And then paralysis, what it's actually going to do is it would kill a unit outright, utterly destroying them. And then if it hits you, it's going to really, really mess you up. On top of then just ending the combat on the spot. And if you were assaulting, it's going to be kicking your butt back to wherever the hell you came from. So they're nasty. The effects of these qualities, however, have no bearing whatsoever on the block phase outside of informing your motivations. That is, you should care very much during the block phase about whether these qualities are on the enemy tokens, because you do not want to be hit by a paralysis effect. But it will not change in any way the process of actually carrying out the block. As such, we're just for now going to put a pin in all of this and save any discussion of these qualities for our discussion of the assigned damage phase, which again is the next video in our series. Before closing the book on block completely, I want to mention that the other expansion that I haven't really been dealing with, Shades of Tesla, does add a couple of qualities to enemy attacks. But I don't actually have that expansion, first of all, and for that reason alone, I haven't been including it in our discussion in this series. Which, you know, this series is really meant for the novice player in any event. And for such players, they're unlikely to be using that expansion right off the bat anyway. But on top of that, an examination of the rulebook for that expansion leads me to think that they're really not going to be remotely hard for you to figure out and pick up if you've already watched and understood this series in the first place. So I don't feel like we've lost a whole lot by ignoring them. So with that, we'll wrap up our 4th installment, and that should be all you need to know about the block phase. If you found this useful or entertaining, please like, share, and subscribe. We'll look next time at the damage phase, rehashing the process for calculating how many wound cards you're supposed to take into your hand when you get hit, discuss how to use units to absorb some damage before it gets to you, and then take a look at unit resistances and how they're different from enemy resistances. And of course, we'll also say something about brutal, poison, paralysis, and assassin effects, as well as what happens when you get knocked out of a fight. Until then, keep your heads down, your shields up, and as always, good hunting, Mage Knights.